we have three guests today. We have Jason Hunt from Government of Pennsylvania. He is actually manager in business attraction and retention in Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. Then Will Butler, senior business development manager at Detroit Regional Partnership, and Antonino Spina from the Italian Trade Agency. Actually, he's the director of ICE New York, and he's the coordinator of all the Italian trade agencies in the US. So I would like you to start with the presentations of who you are and especially what your organization does, thinking about Italian companies and startups and laboratories, as I was mentioning, and then maybe if we'll have the first round, general round, and then the second round I would like you to tell us what your organization could do in concretely, let's say, to support Italian companies as well as other actors from our ecosystem. So I asked Jason to start, and then I leave the floor to the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. It's nice to have the opportunity to speak with you. Sarah had asked me to speak a little bit about kind of what U.S. government entities and U.S. cluster industry specialties can do to help you as you look to help your companies explore the U.S. ecosystem. So I'm going to start kind of big picture, like what the ecosystem here looks like, and then kind of focus in on my corner of it here in Pennsylvania. So as Sarah mentioned, I work for the Pennsylvania government, so one of the 50 states here, and I have counterparts in all of the other states who work to attract international investment to their state. Some of the offices are big, some are small, some are fully government like mine, some of them are a public-private partnership, but they exist everywhere. And you should utilize these entities, myself and my neighbors and competitors, as sources of information because their services are free. And they know their region, they know their strengths, and often they know their companies. Some of us have offices around the world locally. I know we have Patrizia in Italy, in Bologna, and we have 11 other offices around the world that cover other markets, and I know our competitors do as well. There are also some federal government resources. So Select USA is our investment attraction arm of the U.S. Department of Commerce. They have folks in the embassy in Rome, and I believe in the consulate in Milan as well. But they are also a source of information, and they can refer you to us. So if you have a company that you know is looking at, say, the Northeastern United States or the Midwest, you can go to them. They can give you the names and contact information of me and my colleagues in the states or cities that you wish to contact. So they're often a good first stop. Of course, you have your own government resources, and we'll hear about those a little bit later from the Italian Trade Agency. Within the states, most regions also have what we call economic development organizations, or EDOs. You'll hear later from Will in Detroit, who represents one of these entities. Within Pennsylvania, there's at least 10 big ones and several much smaller ones. So the way we work is, we'll hear either from Select USA or from a company directly, or from our counterparts at the Emilia-Romagna regional government about a company that has an interest. We will, with our knowledge of our geographies, will identify what areas make sense for them, or maybe they'll come to us and say, I've got three big customers in Pittsburgh, I need to be near them, help me find the right opportunity. So we will work hand in hand with the local EDOs, and the kind of services that we would provide would be anything from kind of basic information, what's the economy there look like, what are lease prices, how much, what are wage rates for a certain profession, right down to helping you find a building or a suite within a building that fits your needs, and introducing you to local government, to local businesses. Often these EDOs are affiliated with the local chamber of commerce, so they are both public and private, which can be useful to connecting you in with the business community. So kind of at a high level, that's what the government and EDO side of things look like. On the technology side, so kind of the cluster or the innovation ecosystem, there's a couple of other resources that might be interesting depending on your company or your cluster. So both the federal government and the states often run innovation hubs. They're called different things here and there, but the federal government has them for manufacturing, for life sciences, for additive manufacturing, for, a variety of different technologies. And these are usually either fully or partly federally funded centers of excellence, where companies and academic researchers work on cutting edge technologies in a particular sector. And these are scattered all across the country. It depends on what you're looking for. For example, there's a robotics one in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's an additive manufacturing one in Youngstown, Ohio. There's a life sciences one in Maryland. They're all over the place. And they're a useful source of information on kind of what's new and exciting in that particular space. If you, especially for your lab and research and university partners. Now, there's sometimes some speed bumps in dealing with foreign nationals at some of these labs because some of them have work that touches on defense, but there are still, opportunities for collaboration around those. And separate from the ones that are fully federally funded, like those I just mentioned, a lot of universities have kind of unique areas of research which the universities run, but are also partly state or sometimes partly federally funded. For example, there's Drexel University in Philadelphia runs a Center for Functional Fabrics, which is about wearable electronics kind of woven into textiles. And some of these become quite niche, as that one I just described. But if you're looking for a very particular type of technology or research, often Select USA or myself, my counterparts, can help direct you because we know the ones that are within our states or that affect industries that are important to our states, even if they're located elsewhere in the United States. So I guess with that, let me share my screen quickly here and pull up my presentation where I'll give you an example of what kind of information you could expect from a state economic development organization like mine. So it would be kind of a mix of the state overview. So how big is it? What's our economy? What do we do? What are the key industries? A little bit about our largest cities, and then what we can do to help. A lot of it starts with location. So the United States is a big place, and a lot of places that aren't New York or San Francisco sometimes get overlooked when companies, especially innovative companies, are looking at opportunities. But there's opportunities everywhere. So location is key, and you'll often see a map like this that highlights the relevant geography for me, Pennsylvania, with these concentric circles around it. And they're useful to help you judge distance, but they're also useful because the largest one there, 500 miles, represents the approximate distance that a commercial truck can legally travel in the United States in one day. So it's it's a number of hours at the speed limit, so it's right around that distance. So you often see these circles pop up in our presentations. So one of the things that makes Pennsylvania appealing to international companies is excellent access to New York City and Washington, D.C. and the major markets of the East Coast. So we're within a day's drive of 40% of the US population and 60% of the Canadian population, especially now that they're letting us back into Canada as of November. And major international airports, as well as the high-speed rail line running from Boston through New York, through Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. The closer in map of Pennsylvania here, highlighting our interstate systems in red. You'll see maps like these from states often to highlight the infrastructure and their connectivity to other states, which is what we use this one for, and also to highlight some of the lesser known clusters. So of course you've heard of Philadelphia, probably heard of Pittsburgh. I doubt you've heard of St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, which is a hub for powdered metal and additive manufacturing, even though it's a very small town. State College, home to our largest public university, Penn State University, and Harrisburg, our state capital. Not a large city, but still our capital and a hub for the food and agribusiness industry. The GDP comparison like this also helps give you an idea of the scale of the economy. So Pennsylvania is a population of 13 million. We have a GDP of almost 810 billion, which would make us 20th or so in the world if we were an independent country. And our key industry, so I mentioned life sciences a couple of times earlier. It's a big one here. Pharmaceutical manufacturing around Philadelphia is really important, and recently cell and gene therapy has been quite interesting. We have med tech and medical device manufacturing as well. Tech and innovation, I mentioned a couple of different pieces of that, from robotics to industrial automation to cell and gene therapy. And we can dive deeper on any of those if you have questions or a particular interest in that space. Manufacturing is another big one here. It's kind of Pennsylvania's past, present, and future in terms of what we've got going on. And it's a quite diversified sector, anything from fabricated metal products, food products, machinery, chemicals, plastics. A lot of this is based on our location and our natural resources and our relatively low cost of electricity. Food industry, another big one. We lead the United States in mushroom production, which I imagine is a fact you didn't know leading into this. But it's a lot of food, both primary agricultural products and food processing as well. Energy and plastics, I already mentioned, that's built on our natural gas resources in the Marcellus Shale. Philadelphia, our largest city, Pittsburgh, our second largest city, both hubs for education, healthcare, and the innovation ecosystem. And then what we can do to help. So I already outlined a lot of this. We've got offices around the world to help international companies who are looking at opportunities here. And we can provide industry information on the relevant industry, site selection assistance, whether it's finding real estate or finding space for lease. And we also administer grants, low interest loans, tax credits, and training financing for businesses. On the other side of our work, we also help companies to export. And this would be relevant for international companies because our export services include assistance entering the market in Canada and Mexico, which would be probably most easily done from a new US location. We also run a joint venture partnership program for companies that aren't ready to invest outright, but are looking for a partner, either a contract manufacturer to make their products in the US under license and sell, or to jointly develop new products or complementary lines of business. So I know I buzzed through that kind of quickly, but I know you are not necessarily the target audience for this presentation. So I hope that was useful, and I hope I didn't take up too much of Will's time. Will, I think it is your turn now.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks to all the attendees and to Sarah for organizing this great event. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Will Butler. I work for the Detroit Regional Partnership. So we are a regional economic development agency that represents the city of Detroit plus the surrounding 11 US counties. So essentially it's the city, suburbs, and outlying rural areas. And Jason did a great job explaining kind of the structure of economic development in the United States. right? You have the federal level, Select USA, all 50 states usually have an economic development office. And then there's oftentimes these regional groups who I work with. Yeah, constantly working to help companies and organizations either directly set up facilities and operations or traffic cop them essentially to the right resource and right contact. So a lot of, I have some similar things to what Jason pointed out. I would just echo a lot of what he said. He gave some really great advice. So with that, I will share my screen if I can get this to work. All right, is that sharing for you guys?
Yep.
Perfect. Let me back up just a little bit. Yeah, as I was kind of already introducing the Detroit Regional Partnership, there's the concentric circles that Jason was talking about. You'll see this in most economic development organizations with their map. So we're located in the Midwest United States, very close. Pennsylvania is kind of part East Coast, part Midwest, but we're right on the Canadian border. My office actually looks directly at Canada, our services, again, very similar to what Jason outlined, right? It oftentimes starts with the data and market intelligence, understanding cost of labor, understanding tax rates, understanding competitors, potential partners, right? From there, moving to finding office space or a building, to finding technical service providers like a U.S. bank, a U.S. accountant, a U.S. attorney, to government incentives that may come into play, to traffic, as I mentioned, kind of traffic copying you to the right university or right community college or right accelerator. So kind of navigating a region or a state as a whole, that's really what we serve to do. And again, as Jason pointed out, these are free services most of the time. So we are funded, we're a public-private partnership. We're partially funded by the state of Michigan and local governments, and then also partially funded by a few major corporates here in the Detroit region. So what I kind of wanted to do was, obviously there is innovation occurring all across the United States in a broad swath of industries. And I think people are often surprised that while people know Silicon Valley, while they know New York, a lot of tech innovation is happening across the Midwest, across the Southeast. But I did want to spotlight where I thought Detroit at least had global expertise, right? Where while there's innovation, again, in a large variety of industries, this is where we really have a core competency. So one, of course, automotive is our bedrock. It is our foundation. We are the epicenter of the North American automotive industry. That's also a cluster that I know in the Emilia-Romagna region is also a core focus and expertise. Tying along with automotive, manufacturing in the future of Industry 4.0 and smart and advanced manufacturing, really a core focus of us. And then, of course, you also have innovation occurring at the university and college level at higher education, and the technology commercialization and startup creation that's occurring there. So some general advice that I would say, regardless of where you're going within the United States. This was pointed out also by Jason. Don't go it alone. I would absolutely start with the Emilia-Romagna region. I'd start with ICE, right? I'd contact Jason. I'd contact myself, our partners at the state level. You want to make sure that that is one of your first contacts as you're looking, whether you as a association or as a cluster or the startups you're representing. Contact those organizations. They're already built and established to help you come to the U.S. market. I think beyond the East and West coasts, right? I mean, and it's not, of course, depending on your technology, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, LA, New York might be the right region, but I think oftentimes the rest of the country gets overlooked and you're missing out on lower cost options, but also clusters that are, again, globally renowned in these industries, but they're just not on the East or West coast. So I'd also, on a similar way, look, if you're looking to connect with a university around research or collaborating on innovation, I'd also look past what are often the nameplate or prominent universities. A lot of really great research is happening at the regional university level, at our 2-year community college level, as well as some innovation organizations that exist outside of the education system. I'd also, as much as you can, and again, this is where something where ICE and the Emilia-Romagna region can assist with, work to understand who competitors are in the United States, or if it's not a formal company, if you yourself as a cluster are looking to collaborate, try to understand what a use case in the US could be, or for the local market. I'd also recommend partnering up, and I think this is a strength of the clusters and the technopoles, is coming together both as industry, academia, and clusters coming to the US market together. I think that's very powerful. And then lastly is sort of a be patient, build long-term relationships. Michigan has had a strategy where we've been creating MOUs with a number of key foreign partners across the world around specific R&D, and a lot of this is around automotive, but we're actually collaborating on research and innovation along with these foreign counterparts. But those relationships have happened over years, right? And these MOUs happen over a long time. So, I'd make sure you're investing time in building these relationships with your US counterparts. So I'm going to try to quickly go through, again, a little bit deeper dive into these kind of 3 poles I mentioned of where we really have kind of some strong innovation expertise. But, I'll try to go through this fast. And at any point, if we're running close on time, Sarah, I'll leave it to you to cut me off or say we need to move on. That's totally fine. So automotive, as I mentioned, we are still the epicenter of the North American automotive industry, the greatest global presence of automakers that you'll find. So it's incredibly dense, 96 of the top 100 suppliers. The big stat I point out here is that we're almost 70% of all US automotive R&D occurs in the Detroit region. So if you as a cluster or if you as a startup are looking to access automotive R&D, there's probably no greater place where you're going to find an ecosystem of people working on that. And just a quick glance at kind of who the OEMs, and this is an OEM map of who's here. Most prominently, I point out this chart right here, where these are companies that either have headquarters or R&D centers here in Metro Detroit. So coming here, interacting here, gives you access to start interacting with these OEMs. Part of built out of being the home of the automotive industry is that we're an incredibly large cluster of engineers. So we're actually the second largest metro for engineers, both by number as well as location quotient, which is essentially density of these engineers. Primarily, we're very strong in electrical, industrial, and mechanical. Some of our core strengths where we rank 1 or 2 in the nation in those concentrations. So I use this slide to bring up, again, outside of the corporates, these are some organizations that might be worthwhile looking into depending on what technology or innovation you're looking to access. So we're home of the EPA National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory. So that's where all vehicles get certified on their carbon emissions, and research around emissions from the EPA, which is our Environmental Protection Agency, our federal Environmental Protection Agency, occurs here in Michigan. The U.S. Army does all of their vehicle R&D and engineering here in Metro Detroit. And at the University of Michigan, 2 prominent institutions, the Battery Lab, which is actually an open source laboratory to test battery technology, as well as their Transportation Research Institute, which is focusing on the future of transportation, both great partners in the automotive space. And then lastly, I'd point out the Michigan Mobility Institute and Next Energy. These are actually co-located together. One is working on the workforce of the future of mobility. That's the Michigan Mobility Institute. They've launched a new master's program. Next Energy is actually a really great resource. Well, they'll bring in corporates. They'll try to pull federal dollars together to actually do research and deployments focused on both smart mobility and smart grid. So it's really on alternative energy, but in those 2 use cases particularly. We also have public proving grounds, both through universities and separate, that are there to dedicated to testing connected and autonomous vehicles. So again, if you're working in V2I, vehicle to infrastructure, or vehicle to vehicle, or autonomous driving, these are great resources, and again, open to startups to utilize. Lastly, I'll just point out that we did just recently set up a new state office called the Michigan Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, which is dedicated, one of its core missions is to is focused on accelerating the number of startups in mobility in Michigan. And one of the key programs they've done is actually starting a funding platform to help partially provide matchmaking funds to either testing here in Michigan, or actually deploying a real world pilot project with a Michigan partner. So again, something for your startups or your cluster that you could potentially tap into for funding here in the US. And then lastly, we're not New York, we're not Silicon Valley in terms of venture capital, but I did want to bring up that a recent report, we are now actually the #1 state for venture capital growth. This is again primarily in this connected, autonomous, electric mobility transformation that's happening. So the capital side, and I would say this across the United States, VC, private equity are now looking beyond the coast, and they're investing more into Midwest, into the Southeast. They're finding opportunity elsewhere. So I think no matter where you're going in the United States, capital's now, that dynamic of capital is changing for your startup companies. Manufacturing industry 4.0, obviously, given our automotive legacy, very focused on manufacturing, really large cluster in this, but I think where we have a particular expertise is in industrial robotics. And I'd also point out Pittsburgh has an incredible cluster in Pennsylvania around robotics. So this is actually something I think we kind of share. Right now, we are actually the largest deployment of industrial robots in the nation. And this, again, sits at the OEM and tier 1 production facilities in the automotive industry. But you can see the kind of automation and industrial robotics companies that are here. This is an example of University of Michigan, a lab that they built around robotics that may be an opportunity to collaborate with. But this is the slide I really wanted to get to. These are organizations, again, set up to assist you as clusters, as well as your startup companies, get engaged into the automation ecosystem here. So Automation Alley is actually the World Economic Forum's advanced manufacturing hub, and it sits here in Metro Detroit. They also represent a cluster of automation and IoT companies here in Michigan. The North American Association for Automation sits here in Michigan as well. Jason did a great job talking about the federal institutes set up around innovation. We have 2 here in Detroit focused on lightweighting and advanced materials. And I'd agree, sometimes for those that have Department of Defense dollars, foreign companies sometimes have a difficult time interacting, but one of these is actually funded by the Department of Energy, which is our lightweighting institute, and that is very open for foreign companies to interact with. And then last, I'd point out the Centropolis Accelerator, which is partnered with one of our regional universities and focused on helping hardware startups and entrepreneurs who are in manufacturing start accelerating growth. And they actually have a 3D printing space that companies can utilize. It's about 6,000 square feet. So if you need to prototype, if you need access to 3D printers, those are things that can be utilized. This is very quick, but one thing I wanted to point out to that point about looking beyond the coasts is that the Midwest is actually really the cradle, the breadbasket of major university talent, especially top 100 universities. So this is just a 5-hour drive from Detroit, all the universities that you could have access to. And actually what it doesn't show on the map here is it touches into Canada and Waterloo University, which is a very prominent tech university in Canada. But huge talent pipeline for your companies, and then a huge cluster of very prominent universities to interact with from a research and development standpoint. And, to that point, I'd also say, our universities, which we call our University Research Corridor, Michigan State, Wayne State, and the University of Michigan. They rank very competitively with the top university innovation clusters in the United States. So we're #1 in terms of enrollment, actually #2 in terms of degrees awarded in high-tech fields, #3 in terms of innovation index. So again, you can look at these universities, and while they may not be the first that come to mind, they're actually very competitive with some of the most top, the Harvards the Harvards or the Princetons, the Ivy League. They're up there in terms of innovation and in terms of commercializing new technology. So that was it. I hope I didn't take up too much time, but hopefully it was a good overview of the kind of clusters that exist here in Metro Detroit, how to begin interacting with them, and maybe a few practical examples of places and organizations you want to engage with next. My contact information is below. Would be happy to discuss more, or obviously get in touch with Sarah or Iche, and they'll help direct you as well. All right, thanks so much.
So thank you very much. I think it's very interesting to know that 2 more regions, 2 more states of a federal state of the United States are interested in attracting Italian investments and Italian company. I'm very much interested in this kind of presentation because, as I already mentioned in my short presentation, we are not only fashion, we are not only food, we are not only other activities in the design sectors, but in the United States, we have a very, very rich program of promotion of the medium and high tech from Italy. And also we are working a lot in attraction of American investments back to Italy, and at the same time to make easy to be a facilitator of the landing of the Italian companies in the United States in terms of investment for industrial activities or for commercial activities. So it is a totally new scenario, the one that we are studying now. We are deeply going into the Bidenomics. We are trying to identify which are the opportunities that could arise for the Italian companies by the massive investment that has been designed by the US government that is called infrastructure program, but we know that it's every kind of infrastructures that they are having in mind. And what has been depicted by the representative of Pennsylvania and the Detroit regional area, it is very much similar to the activity that we are trying to conduct in the United States in order to inform Italian companies about these opportunities. As a matter of fact, we started collaborating with the District of Columbia a couple of months ago, and we had a seminar of presentation of the business opportunities for Italian companies in the District of Columbia. So this is an opportunity also for me to extend to our partners the possibility of having in a couple of months some seminars or presentation that are going to be much more focused on the possibilities of attracting investments coming from Emilia-Romagna. Not only, of course, from Emilia-Romagna, since we are the Italian trade agency, but I would like to focus on the fact that with Emilia-Romagna, we have been able to conduct some interesting experiments, if you would like to say, about the selection of Italian companies that are considered ideal or at a certain level of development to be introduced in the United States market. And this has been very successful because usually, since we have to take care of a very large number of companies, we are not focusing since the beginning on the selection of the company. And a project of this kind could be very successful only if we have in mind what is the purpose, the target, what it has in the mind of the Italian companies in terms of investment and landing into a special territory of the United States. And having defined the projects, it will be easier for us as an Italian trade agency to take them by hand, to accompany them and make them easier to contact the relevant authorities of the offices of the development that have been mentioned, not only in the regions that are today participating to this event, but also for other states. So I think it's very important, since we see that medium and high tech and anything related to the information and communication technology, anything related to the artificial intelligence is something that it companies coming from the region of Emilia-Romagna will be interested in, developing presence in the United States. As an Italian trade agency, since we have several offices in the United States, I think this is a good opportunity because we have certain specializations by offices, but of course there is a central coordination. So for instance, the office in Chicago is very much, has been working on Italian technologies, Italian machinery, and all the automotive sectors, but the space economy is usually handled by the office in Houston for natural reasons, of course. As well, we have the office of Los Angeles that has been working with all related themes and subjects of the Silicon Valley, and also related to energy and environmental protection. So it's a distribution of the tasks, but at the end, what we are in this market is just one entity, is the Italian trade agency. And as such, we can be the partner of local entities, and we can be, of course, the partner of a regional government like Emilia-Romagna that has been absolutely active. And I already mentioned the fact that there has been a project, it's called Upgrading, that has been very successful because we selected a number of companies that were already with previous experience in the United States market. And the purpose was to upgrade the state of knowledge that they had of the market and upgrade the state of their presence in the market. So supposing that they were only in a limited area, we decided to take care of them and expand the presence of this in other areas. So this is what we have in mind. The idea is to continue our project of collaboration with local development board, economic boards. And we are sure that if we are going to define a project of this kind with a regional government and relevant offices of the regional government of Emilia-Romagna, any kind of support can be provided by the Italian trade agency in this market. Thank you very much to all the attendees. Thank you.
Grazie, Direttore.
Hi, everybody. I'm Valerio Soldani, Deputy Trade Commissioner here in the New York office. As the director mentioned, should you have any questions, I know there are a lot of technopoles and innovation clusters connected in this meeting today, and we've been working with Italian startups, bringing them in partnerships with US accelerators all across our network in the United States. So it's not only what we have in our agenda of events across all the months in the year, but we follow them in the, let's say, the whole export life cycle that a company or an innovation entity like a Technopole could have on the US market. So we have a staff here in Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, Houston, that's ready to assist and let's say provide tailor-made, personalized, customized services to them. So if you ever want to establish a relationship or reach out to US entities or settle in the United States market, we're here to help. And not only in our events and activities that are like on our website, like the Global Startup Program and other events that are more related to some verticals that are really hot right now, like the life science, biotech, and ITC, but even for, let's say, more customized and tailor-made service. So should you have any question where I think that an open mic could be a good idea, since we're, let's say, in a meeting more than a widespread event. What do you think?
But I think that the answer to your second question is it doesn't matter the size of the company. We work with small companies, we work with large companies. The vast majority of the portfolio of companies I work with are what we would call SMEs, or small to medium-sized enterprises, anywhere from 2 employees to 50 employees are kind of about the normal size. And in terms of gauging when they're ready, I would encourage companies or the cluster managers who are working with companies to start the conversations early. Even if you know that you're not ready this year, or your company is not ready this year, it's useful to gather information and to begin the conversation with people who can direct you towards the relevant clusters, industry associations, or universities here. As far as how we allocate our resources and use our time, I mean, of course, a company who is ready to make a big investment and employ a lot of people is going to draw our attention first, but that doesn't mean that we won't work with smaller ones who are just dipping their toes in the water, so to speak. I've worked with companies for 5 years before they ended up making the decision to invest here. We know it's a big decision, and sometimes it takes a while. Will, did I miss anything?
No, I complete and total agreement. So building off of that, Detroit Regional Partnership is the same situation. Companies of all shapes and sizes, for the most part, our core audience tends to be domestic or foreign companies who are maybe a little beyond in the growth phase, clearly in expansion, right? So they have a product, they have sales, they're looking at the next market, but they're not the mega large corporate where truthfully our services often aren't needed. That exists in house, that knowledge exists in house. So that SME, the foreign SME, is kind of right in line where we can really assist. I would say in terms of how to approach us, maybe I'll start there. Of course, if there is, I think I would say maybe a no-no is don't come to a government agency asking for business development support, right? Now the question can be help us find someone who can assist with business development. I would just say that this is often a request that we often receive, and we have to unfortunately answer that we can't serve as sales representatives for foreign companies here in the United States. Sometimes we can leverage relationships where possible, but that's not actually a core focus of ours. And you don't want us acting as sales reps, truthfully, right? Oh, we don't know your technology, but that is a question that gets asked frequently. So that's one thing I'd maybe coach in advance a little bit. As far as approaching the US ecosystem, I would agree, having you as cluster managers for your corporate clients, having those conversations early on, I would 100% agree with. I would say as much as Jason and I are trying to work to attract companies to the United States, I'd probably say look to the EU market first, right? So if you have a startup that's in Italy, they probably should be looking at the broader EU market if they're not already selling and present in the EU market first, before then looking at North America. I was actually, right before this meeting, I was on a conversation with a Belgian and Austrian organizations that were talking about there's automotive suppliers coming to the US market. And one of the big pieces of advice that I totally agree with is, as they do approach the North American ecosystem, travel here frequently. So come here before you're ever setting up an office, come here frequently, try trade shows, try conferences, right? Visit, it is a long, to Jason's point about 5 years, it is a long, intensive process, unfortunately. And so I think visiting frequently, and then after that, once you've kind of tested the market, maybe found some on the ground support and contacts, I would also advise them, and maybe this is getting a little too technical, but make sure that they are having a good technical service provider network here. And by that, and I know that's something Iche can help with, I know it's something probably Emilia Romagna can help with, but a good US attorney, have a US bank account, have a US accountant, right? Those things actually, I think, can sometimes often get overlooked and then bite a company later on down the road. And then the last thing I'd say, outside of, without getting too much in the technicality of, or the granularities of expansion, is just be patient, right? A commitment to, this goes on to how sort of long, intensive a process it is. Coming to the US, they might not see results immediately. And I think companies can be too quick to dismiss the US market or North America, right? This is an investment over a long term. So I hope that maybe I went off in another direction, but I hope that was helpful.
No, very, very interesting. And in fact, I have a few. Yeah, Valerio is.
If I may, Valeria,
Yes,
if I may
please.
add something, I totally agree with Will or Jason on the tips and tricks that they share with our audience here. If I may, I just recall a couple of practical examples that we've been working with Italian companies on. So one of these is after the Biotech San Diego, a big fair that we had in a digital way because Italian companies are not allowed to travel to the United States. We had an announcement from the White House last month, and we are all waiting to the border to open back up again in November, hopefully. So it was all digital, and let's say 20% of the companies, some of them were startups or scale-ups in Italy, they decided to open a branch in the United States. So we can provide, let's say, know-how in terms of the sometimes very complicated regulatory frameworks that are here, not in terms of setting up a branch, but especially in some verticals like biotech, healthcare, or let's say highly technological and innovative industry verticals. So ITA is one of the doors you want to knock to have an overview on that and do your homework before sitting in front of an US counterparts. The second thing is that we have a huge asset portfolio in terms of investors or potential partners, and that could be interesting when a company, an Italian company, is performing, let's say, a preliminary assessment on what they can do, where they're gonna do it, and what they're gonna need to have before having a meeting with the US counterparts. So again, we are here, we got a staff that's specialized on that. So it could be interesting, especially if you are an intermediary working with a company or a university or innovation entity that's in a very let's say regulated framework or industry vertical to, let's say, have a preliminary assessment with us and see what know-how we can provide, what asset portfolio we can share, and what services we're going to provide on that. And for sure, that's the first step I want to take if I want to understand better what's my next step inside the United States. And meanwhile, if you're not allowed to travel, as Will was saying, it's very useful to, let's say, taste the different events and trade-related events to your industry vertical. We still have a very crowded agenda of digital events that we are organizing as an Italian system to the United States, in partnership also with Select USA and other investment attractions entities in the United States. So it could be useful to have a look at that and maybe waiting that the borders open up back again, just try to attend digitally.
Thanks, Marco. I guess there's a couple of pieces to that question. One is that the cluster organization here in the United States is a little bit less formal than the way it is in Italy, and there's a lot less government involvement. So often it's done bottom up by the industry themselves. For example, here in Pennsylvania, we have a really large food industry, but there is not one single large food industry association. For example, the candy companies all have their own association. The mushroom companies have their own association. The snack food companies like pretzels and potato chips, they all have their own association. So it's a little bit more focused on the needs of those companies, both in terms of innovation, packaging, supply chain, all of that. In general, industry associations here will accept international entities or even international companies as members, though it kind of varies on a case-by-case basis. For example, I know our life sciences industry here in Pennsylvania has a cooperation agreement with their counterpart in Emilia-Romagna, and I believe that there are at least a handful of Italian companies who are members of our association here, despite not having any operations here. It's because they want to plug into the network, and we often recommend that as a first step to get to know kind of the what's going on here, who the big corporate players are, and to network. Because often these industry associations here offer services to their members, even their members who are overseas, which include some matchmaking and some warm introductions to potential partners or even potential customers that I, as government, am not able to provide.
I would 100% agree with the fact that our structure as industry associations in the United States, not as formal. It's going to vary between different markets, whether there is an industry association or a cluster association, whether it's active, whether it's relevant. I would also caution that sometimes industry associations here in the United States are less focused on either helping their members internationalize or collaborate or grow sales. Sometimes they're solely focused on actually lobbying for legislation. So they're more political organizations. That's not always the case, but just something to be aware of as you interact. But in my experience of the clusters that are relevant, that are interested in that, they are interested in taking on foreign members. They are interested in collaboration, but this is where I think it goes to yourselves as cluster managers is the biggest value add that you can have to your companies. And I'm probably saying something that's very obvious to you, is information, right? And it's the knowledge of the network in the United States. And that doesn't mean that you have to know everything, but I think it's knowing Jason, it's knowing myself, right? It's knowing others. It's knowing, I think having those contacts and having those relationships across the United States, so that when one of your member companies comes to you and says, we're interested in working with a university, we're interested in working with a corporate, you can kind of start the process. I think, in my perspective, not knowing as much about the clusters on your side, I think that's probably the biggest value add that you can have. So yeah, I hope that was helpful.
I agree with what he was saying about knowledge. And when I was speaking of asset portfolio, I was mentioning context as well. So the contacts that we develop in not only trade shows, but other meetings, and our, let's say, presence here has been really helpful to more than 1,000 companies, Italian companies that have settled here with a branch. And before that, especially for an industry vertical like the food and wine, and Mr. Foschini really knows that well, I guess, because there's a lot of, it's a highly regulated framework when it comes to food and beverage here in the United States. So there's we are able to provide guidance and contacts as well, and especially to let them understand what's the different framework in the different territories, because we have a long-lasting trade relationship to the United States, but nobody knows that let's say 90% of the companies and actors are really focused on the traditional presence areas, like on the two coasts. But we really need to improve our presence in the Midwest territories, in other states that are fast-paced now, that are growing, that are hubs like the Detroit regional area or the Pennsylvania state area that we've seen in the two presentations, because they're really interesting as hubs to serve a really demanding market here. So as you may know, Mr. Foschini, we have a food team here in the New York office that's working all across the 50 states of the United States of America, and we're really able to provide that kind of know-how if needed, and contacts, and make introductions. I insist again on one thing: is not only about attending maybe the fancy food or the other trade shows that we organize and we're famous for, but even relying on our teams for the whole life cycle. So day by day, building that relationship with the US counterparts that are involved in this area. So just another practical example, there was a company from Emilia-Romagna who was involved in the site selection process. So was assessing, let's say, 4 different options in 4 different states, So regulation, incentives, counterparts, they were different in every state, and we had them to, let's say, understand better, have a second opinion, and put them in touch with some professionals like a lawyer in our team here in New York who could provide some more guidance from a legal standpoint. I think that the knowledge part that Jason and Will were mentioning in their speeches and presentations are really important, especially in a highly regulated vertical like the food.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, if there's one takeaway from today's presentation, I think it's ask us questions and ask us for connections. The United States is a big place, and we can all help you in different ways to find the information and the right people. I'll start with your second question. The agreements are important, but really they're a symbol of a relationship that existed before the agreement and continues to exist. What they're useful, I think, for cluster managers is to identify where there are connections that already exist, so you don't have to make them anew. On the mistakes question, I'll highlight two. One that we see a lot from European companies, and also, especially from Italian companies, but from companies all over Europe, is that if you're in a regulated industry, whether it's food or your manufacturing process, produces some kind of emission, there's kind of an assumption that because it's okay in the EU, it will be okay here, and you don't have to worry about it. While it's broadly true that the European Union has tighter regulations on a lot of things than the United States does, that doesn't mean that you can just assume it will be fine. You'll often, the regulatory process here is still a process, and it still takes a certain amount of time. And it's important to factor that time into your plans. The second, I would say, mistake that I've seen just recently from a company that I was working with is to not clearly share what it is you're looking for here. Will and I and our counterparts across the country don't know your industry. We may know your company, or at least have spent some time on your website. But if you don't clearly tell us what you want, whether it's in terms of size of space or technology or connections, it's hard for us to make the right connections. And sometimes we guess, and sometimes we guess wrong. And that's not useful for either of us.
Yeah, mistakes that Italian companies make coming over here. I 100% agree in sort of identifying what your needs are as you approach government or an organization like the state government or like a regional economic organization or ICE. Having a defined sense of what your needs are and asking for those is going to be the clearest path to success. Again, as Jason mentioned, sometimes we can guess, sometimes we can try to diagnose. Like sometimes I think about like a doctor, right? We're hearing all these things and then we're trying to diagnose it, but the more they can firmly identify needs, the most helpful. Maybe this is less relevant for Italians because I know that there are differences even in the EU, right, of business cultures. One of my experiences of EU companies coming to the United States is and I'm open to the group here, whether they agree or disagree, but is that there's often, I think in the EU, there's much more direct around yes or no regarding sales, right? Things are often a little more conservative on the front end, right? As you're trying to make a sale to someone, they're a little more distant or conservative to start. But then once you get a yes, it's a yes. In the United States, I almost find the opposite, right? Especially if you're talking in person. In person, the US corporate may say, oh, wow, this looks really great. This is really interesting. Let's have a next step conversation. And then it may be silence. Right. And I think that comes from the standpoint that the United States, especially in the Midwest and in the Southeast, there's a culture of sort of hospitality, of being overly polite. And so, oftentimes European companies think, oh, I'm in, I've made the sale. And truthfully, it is a longer sales cycle It actually involves you getting in the door multiple times. So, you know, that sounds negative towards Americans, but I mean, but that's often what I hear. And I think that's especially true in the automotive industry, which is what I deal with most frequently. The last thing I'd say that is very minor, and this is for a lot of foreign companies, and again, a little discrediting to us as Americans, change anything in your, for the startups that you're working with, or your member companies, if they have decks or presentations, change it to US dollars, change it to feet, change it to inches. Do not expect that there is a knowledge of conversion either in terms of currency or in terms of the metric system. The more you can make a US entity feel comfortable and that they, you know, that they know the US market, the more success you're going to have.
Thank you very much. Very, I mean, nice tips. Yes. So you said maybe it appears to be a yes, but nothing happens. Does that mean that the Italian company has to insist, or what would be the strategy there? Knock the door again and again? Did you say that?
I'm open to other opinions here, but I do think that it is it's getting in the door multiple times, and so not necessarily insisting and saying, hey, we had a meeting, you said this was great, what happened? But it's, you know, it's really continuing to build that relationship, even if there is a yes at the beginning. I think oftentimes too, you know, again, maybe this is less relevant for Italians. I've heard in France, right, it's almost a contract first and then figure out the details afterwards. And the US is not that way. You know, you have to build the relationship, get the yes, and then there's going to be a lot of back and forth before there's ever a contract. Partly, I think it's because we're a lawsuit heavy nation, but I think it's just also business culture here. The last question, you asked a question about MOUs and partnership agreements, and I forgot to answer that. And I would here again, no surprise, also agree with Jason. Some of them are more meaningful than others. Some of them are, to be fully honest, a little bit more symbolic. I don't think it has huge weight in terms of one of your member companies coming to the United States and saying to another corporate saying, well, we have an MOU, we need to work together. You know, but it is a symbol that a partnership is there, and that it is that one of your member companies would approach Pennsylvania and say, clearly there's a bridge already here. Clearly there's a path of communication. So they're not meaningless at all, but you know, I do want to sort of put them in relevant priority. It is more of a symbol of a path of communication, of a bridge that exists, and maybe a slightly easier pathway to get to the US.
No, well, we have, let's say, a long track record in working with Italian companies, especially small and medium enterprises. And I totally agree with Jason and Will, because there's what I feel is that sometimes there's let's say, some companies, they stumble upon a sense of false confidence. So because maybe we as European citizens, we feel a very strong connection with the United States, and culturally, personally. So it feels like being in, let's say, domestic market, but it's not like that. So it's not like selling in a fellow European country. There's a need to mediate as a cultural and business corporate attitude, as Will was saying. So it's slightly different, and it could be misleading because sometimes we feel it's like so close to us that we forget to do our homework and get ready to, let's say, provide all the information we need to. And I would say, I would not mention the mistakes that some of our companies are making, but I would highlight otherwise the let's say the success stories that some of our companies I'm following, not only startups, but even small and medium enterprises on, you know, achieving successes here in the United States. What they're doing is that they make sure, especially that all their assets in this digital world that we are into right now, because we're not allowed to travel here. We're often in digital meetings and digital trade shows. It means that we need to work carefully on our assets, our presentations, our, let's say, catalogs and prices. The detail that we was mentioning, like the inches and imperial system instead of the metric, decimal metric systems in the measures, or the prices in US dollar final price, it's not something that's there. Many companies need advice on that, because I've seen many catalogs with prices in euros with not a final price listed. You know, if we're selling here, we need to provide something easy and information that's not let's say, confused in the great noise that we have in the digital world. So we have to carefully provide information and do our homework before attending a digital meeting or meeting a US counterparts. What we've been doing is, when we worked in the Bio San Diego and other, let's say, digital events, is that we really sit together, even in digital meetings with the companies, the Italian companies, just to train them and tell them what's needed. It happens all the time, even with companies that have been already selling abroad in foreign countries, but maybe it's the first experience in the United States. So we're here to that, and it's the educational part, especially when it's tailor-made. It's, you know, something that's very useful. I've been reviewing the pitch or the deck of slides from startups that have been already selling their products here in the United States many times, and it's always been very useful, because it's not only me or my team, but we have a team of skilled professionals that can do that. Maybe review your material first before sending them the US counterparts the material. It could be useful to have a double check on that. So I think that false confidence could be something that really leads to mistakes. So I hope that, you know, that could be useful. But if you want to follow up on that, we can share some more tips and tricks on that.
I would add one thing to that in terms of pitch decks, and this is something that I heard from an American venture capitalist on a presentation that I was on last week, was when you're tailoring your pitch deck for an American audience, it should not only share how your product or service or whatever it is solves a problem, but how it will make your audience money. So I know a lot of Europeans focus on solving the problem in their pitch decks, but the profit piece is equally important, especially if you're talking to potential funders. Sure. So I think there's a couple of different pieces at play there. One is kind of here on the domestic focus side within Pennsylvania, our farmers, so the producers of the agricultural products here, do receive some support from the government depending on their sector and what they produce. But I think in terms of Italian companies looking at opportunities here, there's 2 or 3 ways to access incentives within the food industry. The first, which is broadly true of any company, is looking to invest in the United States. There are state and sometimes local government incentives for investments. And usually the dollar figure associated with those is going to depend on the number of jobs, the amount of capital a foreign company invests here, the wages the jobs pay, and the exact location of the investment, because that location is used to assess its economic impact on the community. So, 50 jobs in a very rural part of Pennsylvania is a big deal. 50 jobs in downtown Philadelphia is not. And that's kind of the assessment. There are also some sector-specific incentives, at least here in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure elsewhere. For example, we have a strong dairy sector, but historically our dairy sector has been very focused on fluid milk, so gallons of milk, but people are drinking less milk. So now the sector here is looking to pivot towards value-added products like cheese, whey, baby food, other types of milk products. So we have specific incentive programs for companies who will buy milk and turn it into something. And that, the similar dynamics exist in other industries elsewhere. I hope that at least partially answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks.
I would also just add, agreed completely, again, as always. But incentives in the United States are mostly they mostly exist at the state and local level, right? And they are based on job creation. I mean, I'll be honest, our toolbox here in Michigan, and this isn't true of every state, though is true of most states, I think, in the US, is that the toolbox for startups is not as large as it is for large investment projects, right? And it's due to the ROI factor of new jobs in our market, right? It's the more tax revenue, but the outside of incentives, the soft services that an economic development organization, whether it's Pennsylvania, whether it's ICE, whether it's ourselves, right? Hugely valuable. But the other thing I would just point out is partnerships. I think as you talk about some of your small food companies, there may not be monetary incentives on the table just yet for them, but one of the biggest things I think that we could probably come to the table with is that JV, right? The joint venture opportunity, the ability to find a potential supplier, right? I think that's probably where we can most tangibly come to the table to help them access. There tends to not be as much of a pool of public funding for startup activity here in the US. I'll maybe try to take a stab really quick. I think I'm speaking maybe more from a Michigan perspective, because I'm not familiar necessarily the landscape in other US states or other US locations. This is something I actually feel like is a weakness, at least here in Michigan, but I think in the United States. I think the EU has a very well built out structure around establishing R&D projects in collaboration across multiple corporates, universities, that triple helix model of bringing everyone together to accelerate innovation. And part of that's because the EU, right, doesn't have those job creation incentives, and this is where the value add really becomes. And I actually think this is a weakness in the US, and it's also, I think, partially due to our more decentralized nature. Right, that R&D, that innovation, a lot of times is in-house within a corporation. It does not exist at the public level, though there are exceptions to this. Right, we talked about some of those federal institutes, right? The two that sit here in Detroit around lightweighting and advanced composites. Right, there are university resources around this. I mentioned a few nonprofits like Next Energy, which is in the alternative energy space. So there are exceptions to this, but I guess the takeaway being that it is far less formal, far less structured, and it is not like a direct process to make that happen. So for you guys as cluster managers, bringing the assets of your cluster of all of your organizations, I mean, I think that is welcome, that's interesting, that's valuable. I just wanted to caution that I think from my knowledge, there's less of a direct path than exists within the EU or within Italy. I don't know if others agree or disagree.
Will, I think you're right in terms of the way the kind of innovation pathways are structured here. You're right that a lot of them live within corporations or are run by universities with some federal funding, but with not an enormous amount of government direction. I think, Federico, your question about bringing a project forward for potential partnership, I think that's certainly possible. It is not necessarily directly within my mandate or perhaps Will's, but if it's in a sector that is really interesting or important for our states, we can sometimes play a facilitating role in matching you with the right university, the right company, the right cluster. Here, I know there's one that I'm working on right now, an Italian company, which has an industrial automation technology and is looking for a partner here in Pennsylvania to adapt their technology for a new industry. So we've made some introductions for them, and that type of project we support, because it's, you know, it's an important part of our industrial makeup here, even though that type of work is kind of peripheral or secondary to my what I generally do every day.
Thank you. So I think it's time to go. And I would like to thank you all, especially our 4 guests. Feel free to get in touch with them through me or directly with them. And once again, thank you very, very much. It was very interesting